Hello, welcome to my virtual South by Southwest education conference presentation. My name is William Millingworth. I'm an instructional designer at Penn State University, and I'm very excited to share some information with you today through this virtual context. My original talk was titled, Let's Talk About the Discussion Forum. This session was going to be given live as a Future 20 session at South by Southwest Edu 2020. But of course, in the context of the world as it is, here we are in a new medium. And I do hope that the importance of this subject is not lost in the midst of a time where everybody is moving into some sort of virtual context. My talk today will, of course, be colored with a new light and a new bit of information as we are processing remote instruction and the importance of online education at this time. But I do want you to take a moment as we begin to dig into this subject and consider how discourse and the discussion forum tool in online education can impact you in your professional work with your colleagues and with students in the learning design field. Feel free to connect with me on Twitter, seen in the bottom left-hand side of the screen, as well as connecting through hashtags and communication like that. A link to this resource in the bit.ly in the bottom right-hand side of the screen. That'll be at the end of the presentation as well. So who am I? Of course, William Illingworth, that's useful, but a little bit of my interest in the subject comes from my history. In the K-12 space, I was traditionally homeschooled from kindergarten to the 4th grade, and then I joined cyber charter schools and remained in cyber charter schools through the 12th grade. So in all those contexts, my learning was self-regulated and self-motivated sometimes. But of course, throughout it, I was either connecting with people through a virtual space or just by email and things like that. In the 11th and 12th grades, however, I joined the community college. I was able to start taking some classes in that context, and it was my introduction to discourse. For the first time in the 11th grade, I sat in a classroom and I heard the instructor ask for a question and receive responses. And I had the instructors ask us to engage one another. And I was able to share my thoughts and bounce them off of my peers and off of my instructors and get this engagement that I had never had before. Imagine in the 11th grade, this seems to be a little trite, but for me, it was a significant experience. And the subtitle on this slide, The Spectrum of Education Failed to Engage Me in Discourse, is true in the sense that whether I was in homeschooling, right? So some of my discourse was there with my parents, but I was a younger age. So what was the value of that, or what was the understanding of that as a motivated learner or in that regulation process? But going forwards into that cyber charter school experience, there was the opportunities for instructors, and there were opportunities for synchronous learning, but it wasn't the mainstay. Most of my cyber charter experience was self-paced, self-regulated learning. Take a quiz, read a lesson page, take an exam. What that results in then, as I moved into the higher education space, I really enjoyed that discourse with my colleagues. But I then went into, right, my senior year and my first years of college where I was introduced to the discussion forum, the formal post once by Wednesday, reply twice by Sunday night design. And I didn't really enjoy it. It didn't work well, right? I spent a lot of time putting my work in there and making these lengthy posts or meeting the minimums, meeting the maximums, but it still wasn't feeling like that first experience in the 11th grade and in the 12th grade in my classes at community college. When we would do these discourses online, it really felt like I would write a paper and throw it at someone else. I've taken to calling that process more of a pedagogical methodology of text-based analysis and response, where the goal usually of those discussion forums is read this article, watch this video, consider this question, consider the chapter for this week's readings, right? Analyze it and then respond in some paper format. And that T-bar approach is that idea of write, throw, respond, write, throw, respond. And I use the throw very intentionally to say, My goal in saying it is not necessarily to discuss it. My goal in writing my discussion response is to meet the minimum and answer the question. Sometimes that cultivates discourse, sometimes it doesn't, and that really depends on the motivation and the regulation of the learners. But that T-bar experience really stuck with me in my undergraduate learning, and then even some of my work after undergraduate until I got to grad school. And in grad school, one of my instructors specifically started the class without using any discussion forums. We used an instant messaging platform called Slack, and all of the engagements would happen in more of a synchronous time frame. We weren't required ever to be online with one another at the same time, but every post was more about chat, was more about discourse. And so what I really found in that class, in the scope of discourse, was community. And this harkens back to my theoretical framework for the speech. I consider the community of inquiry to be a driving learning theory for my work in the learning experience and learning design field. The community of inquiry is intended to bring the learners and teacher together in a process of engagement, which requires them both to be present, right? So the students have to show up, the instructor has to show up, and there's a lot about how we do that and how we work that out and what the research tells us through the community of inquiry framework. But the goal, of course, in inquiry is questions, is engagement, is discourse. And so as I engaged that in my graduate classes, I thought for myself, like that 11th grade experience, wow, this can be done. It was such a powerful experience for me that I was engaging this at grad school because I was taking it back into my workplace and doing that in my profession. Discourse is not something that can be easily defined for a learning objective as to I want this exact result. But of course, with discourse, we do know that both parties are engaging. Both parties are asking questions. Both parties are presenting information or facts. And both parties may be causing dissonance or disagreeing with one another. But of course, coming from the community of inquiry framework, right, the goal of this is to learn better, to learn well, and to do it in respectful context. The teacher shows up, the students show up not to break each other down, but to build one another up. And so that became really important to me. And I was able to analyze through the process of reflection and those courses I did in graduate school and then in my work here as a learning designer, instructional designer afterwards, that digital discourse, right, the process of the discussion forum, the actual method behind it, hinges on three key elements: time, media, and people. The time involved in discussion forums is typically completely asynchronous. There is no assumption that the students will be on at the same time. They are without the same time. Post by Wednesday means that folks are doing some work by that time frame, and post by Friday or by Sunday means that folks are doing some things in that same time frame or shared space. But there's no assumption that they'll work together or that they'll actively engage in any sort of synchronous or asynchronous piece. The media, of course, discussion forums, that's on Canvas, that's on Blackboard, that's on our learning management systems sometimes. Other times it can be on Slack, Microsoft Teams, right? Some very popular tools these days. Even Zoom can be a media tool that delivers digital discourse. And lastly, of course, people being the fact that both parties, if that's 1 against 3, if that's one student against the rest of the class in kind of a pseudo debate, whatever the people are, that they're showing up, that they're engaged, that they're motivated. We do have a lot of assumptions about what's happening in the learning process with this, but discourse hinges on these three tools, these three elements in a digital context. So what do we do, right? This is intended to be a future 20 class or a future 20 session. I'm here to cast some vision on what we can be doing with the discussion forum. I believe the teachers and students need to come together in these practices and consider the impact of time, media, and people on our learning practices. If T-bar is a method, the text-based analysis response is a method of discourse, what I actually call on that is not to throw that method out. The once by Wednesday, the twice by Friday method is not wrong. What I believe is that it really leans heavily on the analysis. It lies heavily on the synthesis. And maybe something that we could do with those kinds of discussion forums is change the time element, right? So the media isn't wrong, the discussion forum in Canvas or something like that, it's not wrong. The people are still assumed to be participating, that's okay. But is there something with the time? Maybe students need to post once a day, but the posts need to be shorter. Maybe students need to post only one original thought, right? And then only questions to other folks, and every question should be followed up with an answer. So the timing of the discourse itself in those discussion forums can be adjusted and make the T-bar method all the more fruitful. However, what I think we can also do is, like those grad classes I experienced, and like I continue to design with faculty in my learning spaces, to consider the synchronous element of discourse, right? If we can get one another together in Zoom or get one another together in Slack or Teams, we can engage discourse at a whole new level. That, to me, is an opportunity to have students expressing thoughts and rightfully wrestling with them, with an instructor there, an expert mediator there to manage and maintain the process, so that if someone disagrees, or if it's a political conversation, or if it's just a insight into a philosophy that people are not sure about or find concerning, right, that can be mediated and done well. Too often in our culture now, we say, at the holiday table, we don't talk about religion or politics or difficult subjects, and I think that is a disservice to our learning opportunities. We can come back to those subjects if we start practicing discourse more faithfully and in more ways, especially if we can practice it and model it healthily in the learning experiences in our online classes. This is where the teachers and students have to agree, and they have to begin taking this action on themselves. If the teachers come forward with this mindset of, we're going to try this synchronous discourse or semi-synchronous discourse, right? Like my class, we were not required to be on at the same time. Sometimes we happened to chat live and at the same time. Sometimes I would post on a Monday night and somebody wouldn't reply to me till Tuesday in the afternoon, and that was okay. That's not the goal, is to be explicitly or exclusively synchronous. But the teachers and students have to come together and agree that the teachers will create a discourse space that is safe, that has the expectation of excellence, that is professional, and the students have to come and engage with the inquiry, have to ask the hard questions, have to be willing to share the hard thoughts. And at the merge of those two things, I think we will find so much better practices in our learning and in our life with how we can discourse and engage with one another. My what can we do statement, you can see on the right here, this kind of gives the visual representation of some sort of like chat or text bubble space. I think instantaneity is a useful way to bring discourse into online education. As I was just saying, it's not about explicit synchronous work. It doesn't have to be two students on in a Zoom, but there are ways besides the discussion forum to engender discourse. And so often I can reflect on personal experiences of seeing discourse happening among my siblings and things like that in text threads, where someone shares a political thought or a political meme, and we get to engage one another. And those texts, of course, can happen immediately. We can be immediately present with one another through a text format. But sometimes, right, a text does take some time to get back to. Of course, we understand in online education, there's usually this burden to keep content happening week by week. And sometimes we have 6-week courses, 8-week courses, even 12 weeks is just a little bit more condensed than those 15-week courses, where the time feels so important and we have to get them done. But maybe if we are discoursing every day, or maybe if we're discoursing every other day, Or maybe if we're doing it in instant messaging, maybe it can happen throughout the course, and it doesn't have to be on a Wednesday, Friday pace. It doesn't have to be on a weekly pace. These are some of the vision opportunities I offer you to say, consider the synchronous space, consider reimagining how discourse can take place in your course, whether it's online or even for the face-to-face classes, and if you want to consider a hybrid component. Special thanks go out to my wife, Marissa, to colleagues David Netz and Dr. Marcelo Borge, countless others who have helped me with this process. It's taken a lot to think through what this subject means to me and the value of it in my life, and to begin to work it out in my daily experience. Thank you.